Ziyad ibn Abihi is known as one of the toughest and the harshest governors of the Umayyad period. While Hajjaj ibn Yusuf was notorious for his brutality, Ziyad ibn Abihi set the mold. Interestingly, Ziyad ibn Abihi was, at one point, an enemy of the Umayyads. Ziyad had served in Ali ibn Abi Talib's army, radiallahu anhu, during the civil war with Muawiyyah ibn Abi Sufyan. In fact, Ziyad had helped to quell a rebellion against Ali in Basra that many suspected was instigated by Muawiyyah. So how did he go from being a deputy governor for Ali ibn Abi Talib to being one of Muawiyyah's most powerful governors? That's what we're going to discuss today. But first, let's discuss the jizya. The jizya. It is a common misunderstanding that the Muslim Arabs who conquered the lands of Syria and Persia simply adopted the existing administrative structures of the Romans and Sassanids. However, modern scholarship brings evidence of something different. It appears the Arabs brought their own financial system out of the deserts and adapted it to the new empire they held. This is most clearly evidenced in the Islamic system of taxation. The Islamic jizya, or non-Muslim tax if you will, is often portrayed negatively as a tribute to the conquering Muslims. Certainly, the Quran discusses it in a somewhat aggressive tone. Fight those who do not believe in Allah nor in the last day, and who do not forbid what Allah and His Messenger have made forbidden, and do not adopt the religion of truth from those who were given the scripture, until they give the jizya willingly and are humbled. Chapter 9, verse 29. Now let's be clear. At its root, the jizya is just a tax, similar to the zakat, which is sort of a charitable tax. However, the zakat has a spiritual and religious aspect to it. The root word of zakah is zakaya, meaning to purify. When Muslims pay the zakat, they're purifying their wealth. But since non-Muslims do not share the same beliefs, they can't be asked to spiritually purify their wealth. The root word of jizya is jaza'a, meaning to recompense or to pay back. A related phrase is when Muslims use the word jazakallahu khairan, meaning may God pay you back with good. The jizya is a tax paying the government back for protection and the services that it provides. The Muslim scholars have debated about who should pay the jizya. A minority have proposed that only the people of the scripture, that is, Christians and Jews, have to pay the jizya. Everybody else, if they're not Muslim, they must either convert to Islam or leave the area. But historically, it has been more common to apply the jizya to all non-Muslim inhabitants of an area regardless of their faith. The Zoroastrians of Persia paid the jizya during the time of the righteous caliphs, and many centuries later, the Hindus of the Indian subcontinent paid jizya to the Muslim Mughal dynasty, at least during the reign of Aurangzeb and a few other sultans. The Quran does not specify just how much the jizya has to be. Generally, that is left up to the Muslim government to decide. For the righteous caliphs and the rulers of the early Umayyad dynasty, this system worked out pretty well. The Muslims were a ruling minority, and the non-Muslims living under them paid to keep the system running. But as the Umayyad rulers became more extravagant, this system began to kind of break down. This was further accelerated by the rapid growth of Islam in the empire. You see, the Muslims did not remain a minority for a long time. Over the years, their non-Muslim subjects eventually converted to Islam. And when they did, the Umayyads who were ruling over them were faced with a problem. Initially, it was easy to tell who was Muslim and who was not Muslim. Basically, all of the Arabs were Muslim and all of the non-Arabs were not Muslim. Therefore, non-Arabs paid jizya and Arabs paid zakat. But this line began to blur as more non-Arabs became Muslim. The government was receiving double the tax income from these non-Arab Muslims. These new non-Arab Muslims were religiously obligated to pay the zakat, yet the Umayyad government did not relieve them of the jizya that their Christian and Zoroastrian forefathers had to pay. And as the caliphs within the Umayyad dynasty became more corrupt, they found it impossible to reverse this trend. Their lifestyles depended on this double taxation of this new class of Muslim. Naturally, obviously, this frustrated these new Muslims, and this discriminatory practice brought social upheaval that would eventually and ultimately lead to the downfall of the Umayyads. Ziyad in Persia. After Muawiyyah captured Iraq, he began dismantling Ali's government as he didn't want too many die-hard Ali supporters in his administration. But Ziyad ibn Abihi did not step down immediately. When Muawiyyah's forces moved in to occupy Kufa and Basra, Ziyad ibn Abihi, who at this time was still on the Ali side of things, he remained in his secure fortress in Persia. So Muawiyyah sent Mughira ibn Shu'bah, the governor of Kufa, to convince Ziyad to pledge the allegiance, to give him the bay'ah. Mughira met with Ziyad ibn Abihi and pleaded with him and promised him safe passage to Damascus, but Ziyad would not budge. Ziyad knew that the caliph would eventually send an army to flush him out, but that would not have been easy. Ziyad's fortress was hidden deep within the Zagros mountains of Persia, over 300 miles from Basra. Muawiyyah would have to send thousands of soldiers through unfriendly territory and inhospitable terrain. Ziyad may have been untouchable, but his family was not. He soon received a letter from one of Muawiyyah's generals, a man named Busr ibn Abi Arta, telling him that his 3 sons had been imprisoned. This is what Busr's letter read: "Respond to Amir al-Mu'mineen, or I will kill your children." Ziyad knew that this was a true threat because Busr was notorious for hunting down and killing those people who were suspected of being involved with Uthman radiallahu anhu's death. But Ziyad's response to this threat was legendary. He said, "That is exactly what I'd expect from the son of the eater of livers." If you're not familiar with this, this was a reference to Hind, Muawiyyah's mother. A little bit of background here. During the Battle of Badr, the first major conflict between the Muslims of Medina and the pagan Quraysh of Mecca, the Prophet ﷺ's uncle, Hamza, killed 3 members of Hind's family. Hind was Muawiyyah ibn Abi Sufyan's mother. To avenge their death, she hired an Abyssinian slave to kill Hamza the next time they met in battle. And in return for killing Hamza, she promised this slave his freedom and some gold jewelry. Well, a year later, Muawiyyah's father, Abu Sufyan, led an army to Medina in the Battle of Uhud. The Abyssinian slave fulfilled his duty and he drove a spear through Hamza's chest, impaling him to the ground and killing him. After the battle was over, Hind, that is Abu Sufyan's mother, split open Hamza's belly. Remember, he was dead at this time, took out his liver and took 3 bites. So that's why Ziyad ibn Abihi was referring to Muawiyyah ibn Abi Sufyan as the son of the eater of livers. Ziyad and Muawiyyah. Ziyad ibn Abihi sent his brother to Damascus to see what Muawiyyah wanted. Ziyad's brother was furious when he met with Muawiyyah. Here's what he's reported to have said: "This is not what we gave bay'ah to you for. The people did not give you their allegiance so you could kill children." This was, of course, in response to the threat from Busr ibn Abi Arta about killing Ziyad ibn Abihi's children. Well, Muawiyyah agreed that maybe that had gone a little bit too far, so he wrote a letter ordering Busr to release the children. Ziyad's brother hurried back to Iraq with Muawiyyah's orders, and he arrived just minutes, according to Tariq al-Tabari, he arrived just minutes before Busr was going to kill the kids. Now, Ziyad knew Muawiyyah had not given up, and so he instructed his nephew, a young man named Abdurrahman, to hide his wealth. And sure enough, Ziyad soon received word that his nephew Abdurrahman had been arrested by Mughira ibn Shu'bah. This next part was related in Tariq al-Tabari. Now, these are Sahaba we're talking about, so I want to remain respectful. So I got to preface this by saying that Allah knows best just how true this story is. But basically, Here's how it goes. Mughira tried talking and convincing Abdurrahman, that is Ziyad ibn Abihi's nephew, into revealing the location of Ziyad's wealth. But when that didn't work, Muawiyyah ordered him to use what we would now call enhanced interrogation techniques, or in other words, torture. Mughira covered Abdurrahman's face with a silk cloth and poured water over it until the young man passed out. And then Mughira had him revived and asked him again about Ziyad's wealth, and when the nephew didn't give up the information, he went back to being, waterboarded. He was basically waterboarding this young man. Abdurrahman passed out 3 times before Mughira ibn Shu'bah was convinced that he didn't have the information that he wanted. Well, Ziyad ibn Abihi, he continued to hold out against Muawiyyah for another 2 years before finally Muawiyyah wrote him a letter promising safe passage if he would just talk to him. Here's that message. Why are you making things harder for yourself? Come to Damascus so we can go over your finances. If you want to join our side, then do so. If not, you'll be allowed to return to your fortress. So after 2 years of hiding out in this fortress, Ziyad relented and he made the long journey to Damascus to meet with Muawiyyah. They actually wound up talking about much more than finances because Muawiyyah was interviewing Ziyad for a job. And as their companionship, as their meeting progressed, Ziyad ibn Abihi began to warm up to Muawiyyah and he began to address him as Amir al-Mu'mineen, and he agreed to turn over his wealth. And then he asked Muawiyyah for permission to settle in Kufa, which Muawiyyah permitted. Once he was in Kufa, Ziyad was one of many out-of-work former government officials from Ali's Caliphate. He hadn't been given any job yet by Muawiyyah. Muawiyyah was just testing him out, trying to see what kind of man he was. And also, once he had surrendered to Muawiyyah, he had to give up most of his wealth, so his wealth had been confiscated. So Ziyad ibn Abihi, he had no wealth, he had no status, he had no authority. And like many other former officials within Ali's government, Ziyad was forced to pray in congregation at the masjid every day. This was so the governor, Muawiyyah ibn Shu'bah, could keep an eye on these folks. Unlike most of the other former supporters of Ali, Ziyad ibn Abihi had no problem switching allegiances to Muawiyyah, as we'll soon see. Abdullah ibn Amir. Before Ziyad ibn Abihi came on the scene, a man named Abdullah ibn Amir was Muawiyyah's governor of Basra. Abdullah ibn Amir was a Sahaba from Banu Umayyah. However, the people of Basra were always complaining about him. Their main complaint was that he wasn't doing enough to stop criminal activity, and they blamed his reluctance to amputate the thieves' hands as the main cause. In response to this accusation, Tariq al-Tabari reports that Abdullah ibn Amir said the following: I know these people personally. How can I look a man in the eyes knowing I've amputated their brothers or their father's hands? But it was really Abdullah ibn Amir's poor handling of a rebellion in Khurasan that kind of sealed his fate with Muawiyyah. Khurasan was notoriously difficult to govern, and the local tribesmen did not pay their taxes willingly. They didn't pay the jizya willingly, basically. And they eventually rebelled, and the sub-governor fled to Basra, hoping for reinforcements. Instead, Abdullah ibn Amir, who thought the sub-governor had abandoned the city out of cowardice, had him arrested, flogged, and then thrown into prison. Well, the sub-governor's family and his supporters complained to Muawiyyah, who decided at that point that, you know what, Abdullah ibn Amir, you have to go. Now, Muawiyyah had heard of Ziyad ibn Abihi's administrative qualities, and he wanted him to govern Basra instead. But here's the thing. Muawiyyah could not just fire Abdullah ibn Amir, who was from the same tribe and who also happened to be a Sahaba, and then replace him with some unknown man who was rumored to have been a bastard. Yes, Ziyad ibn Abihi means Ziyad, the son of his father. We'll get to that in a moment. He couldn't just toss out his own tribesmen and bring in this other guy just like that. Not to mention this other guy, that is Ziyad ibn Abihi, had once been on the side of their enemy, Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu. Muawiyyah just couldn't do that. So instead, Muawiyyah quietly dismissed Abdullah ibn Amir and then appointed a minor Syrian official to take over as the interim governor of Basra. And sure enough, the Syrian official proved pretty much incapable of handling the job of managing Basra, and within 4 months, Muawiyyah had fired him as well and sent a letter appointing Ziyad ibn Abihi as the governor of Basra. The hudud. When most people think of the Sharia or Islamic law, the first thing that comes to mind are harsh, outdated punishments from their perspective, not my perspective. This is from their perspective. The most famous example, of course, is the amputation of the thief's hand. This punishment is indeed mentioned in the Quran. And the thief, both male and female, cut off their hands, a reward for what they've earned, and a deterrent from Allah, and Allah is mighty and wise. Chapter 5, verse 38. Based on today's standards, many people would probably consider this a harsh penalty. However, we have to remember that this law was meant to be a deterrent. At the time that the Quran was revealed to Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, amputation was a fairly common punishment for stealing. Other forms of punishment for stealing including beating, slavery, and even death. It is more accurate to think of the Quran as establishing a limit for the punishment of theft, rather than thinking of it as a harsh punishment. This becomes even more evident when we consider the Arabic word for punishments, which is hudud, has the same root as the word for limit. Now, there are several conditions that have to be met before someone's hand can be amputated, before amputation can be carried out. The stolen item has to have been secured and put away. There must be at least 2 witnesses to the crime, or the person can, of course, admit against themselves. And the value of the stolen item must be above a certain amount. Even with these limitations, the government or the judge or whomever is in charge may choose not to apply that particular punishment. For example, when Syria was struck with famine during the Khilafah, during the reign of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu, he suspended the hudud for stealing. And finally, not all thefts are treated equally. Contrary to popular opinion, shoplifting and stealing food does not automatically bring amputation. And if the owner of the stolen item gives it to the thief, then the punishment can be averted. Just like the jizya, the hudud should be considered more of a guideline. And considering the many limitations, most forms of what we would consider theft today would not even qualify for amputation. And in all of this, Allah knows best. Ziyad ibn Abihi. Ziyad ibn Abihi has been described as a red-faced man with a white, triangular-shaped beard and a right eyelid that drooped a little bit lower than the left. Along with Muawiyyah, Amr ibn al-As, and Mughira ibn Shu'bah, Ziyad has been known as one of the 4 clever Arabs. Ziyad ibn Abihi was famous for 3 things: his absolutely outstanding oratory skills, his ability to manifest order out of chaos, and his heavy-handed style of government. Ziyad was born in the town of Ta'if near Mecca around the same time that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ made the hijrah to Medina. His mother, Sumayyah, was a member of the Thaqif tribe. He has been known as Ziyad ibn Sumayyah, and later on in life, Ziyad ibn Abi Sufyan. Aisha, the Prophet's widow, politely called him Ziyad ibn Abihi, which means Ziyad, the son of his father. And that is how he is most commonly known today. It's not clear who his father was. Some say his mother was a slave who was impregnated by her master and then sold away. There are some stories that say his mother was a prostitute and his father was one of her clients. And some say his mother was a slave whose owner prostituted her for profit. Despite his unknown paternal lineage, Ziyad ibn Abihi managed to obtain fairly high government positions. And this was a remarkable achievement considering just how important lineage and tribal nobility was in Arabia at that time. He was driven by ambition and the need to overcome his scandalous background, and so Ziyad ibn Abihi worked his way up through the governmental bureaucracies of Caliphs Omar, Uthman, and Ali radiallahu anhum. He started out as a scribe, and by the time the fighting broke out between Ali and Muawiyyah, Ziyad ibn Abihi was a finance minister for Basra under Ibn Abbas, who was the governor for Ali ibn Abi Talib. Towards the end of Ali's reign, when the fighting was going on between him and Muawiyyah, towards the end of Ali's reign, a rebellion broke out in Fars, which is in eastern Persia. Based on Ibn Abbas's recommendation, Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, based on Ibn Abbas's recommendation, Ali made Ziyad the governor of Fars with orders to quell the rebellion. Ziyad's performance was legendary. Using a combination of bribes, brutality, and diplomacy, he managed to put down the rebellion in just a few weeks. Ziyad even strengthened Ali's position in Fars by reinforcing the main fortress and resuming the flow attacks and come back to Kufa. That was Ali's capital. And that ability, that feat right there, that's what attracted Muawiyah's attention. Ziyad in Basra. There were many reasons why Muawiyyah wanted Ziyad to take over in Basra. First of all, Ziyad was familiar with Basra because he had worked there for Umar, Uthman, and Ali. Ziyad was not from Banu Hashim, which was Ali's clan. Remember, he was from the Thaqif clan, at least on his mother's side, so he was much more trustworthy. And finally, Ziyad had proven his ability to handle rebellion and the Khawarij. Still, however, Muawiyyah was not sure if Ziyad would be accepted in Basra. It was bad enough that many would see him as a traitor for switching sides, for going from Ali to Muawiyyah. But then there was also that pesky little issue of Ziyad's lineage. What would people say about a governor who was called the son of his father, because nobody knew who his father was? And so Muawiyyah found a way around that obstacle. In 44 AH, with Ziyad's approval, Muawiyyah announced that Ziyad was his half-brother. Together, these two men concocted a story that Muawiyyah's father, Abu Sufyan, had fathered Ziyad outside of wedlock before he accepted Islam. Therefore, Ziyad ibn Abihi should be known as Ziyad ibn Abi Sufyan. Now, this ruse, this lie, didn't fool anyone. The Banu Umayyah were absolutely furious that Muawiyyah disgraced their family for political gain, and it was even worse that his father was not even alive to defend himself. Later scholars would actually criticize Muawiyyah for defiling his father's legacy with this fake story. And behind his back, Ziyad was still referred to as either the son of his father or the son of Sumayyah. But for the time being, the story served the purpose that was needed. In Jamada 45 AH, that is around July 665 CE, Ziyad ibn Abihi became Muawiyyah's governor of Basra. Upon becoming governor, Ziyad ibn Abihi delivered a speech laying out his plan to bring stability back to Basra. Now, even when we translate this into English, his exceptional oratory skills just come shining through. Listen to this excerpt from Ziyad ibn Abihi's speech. All praises to Allah for his virtues and blessings. The terrible things which the bold among you commit and the wise among you allow are extreme ignorance. The young grow up with these crimes and the old do not refrain from them. It is as if you did not hear the verses of Allah, nor read his book, nor heard of his reward for the obedience, nor heard of his punishment for the disobedience. You have innovated things which were never here before. You frequent the brothels and allow the strong to usurp the weak. You do not restrain the robbers from prowling at night, nor prevent them from attacking by day. You have put kinship before Islam. You give excuses to yourselves and you pardon the thief. Beware of night prowling, for I will shed the night prowler's blood. Beware of the calls of the days of ignorance, for I will cut out the tongues of those who call to it. You have invented new crimes, and we have invented new punishments for every crime. Whoever drowns someone, then I will drown him. Whoever burns someone, then I will burn him. Whoever breaks into a house, then I will break into his heart. Whoever digs up a grave, then I will bury him alive. Spare me your hands and your tongues, and I will spare you my hand and my harm. You are free to hate me, but do not do so openly. We have become your rulers and protectors. We rule you by the authority of Allah which He has given us. Therefore, you owe us your obedience, and we owe you justice. Pray to Allah for the righteousness of your rulers. They set the example, and so long as you are righteous, then they will be righteous. By Allah, I have many potential victims from among you. Beware, lest you become one of them. Well, Ziyad ibn Abihi was true to his word. Over the next 3 years, Ziyad would use violence, bribery, and his terrifying police force, the Shurta, to bring order to Basra. Under Ziyad, the Shurta in Basra had a force of 4,000 men. By comparison, the city of Atlanta in the United States today has only about 2,000 police officers. The Shurta were Ziyad's eyes and ears in Basra. Nothing happened in Basra, but Ziyad knew about it. He arrested people on mere suspicion, and he punished them just to set an example. And when he walked through the streets of Basra, he was accompanied by 500 armed guards carrying clubs, swords, and sticks. But violence wasn't Ziyad ibn Abihi's only weapon. He even got the nobility and the religious elite of Basra on his side by hiring hundreds of Islamic scholars and Sahaba. They served as advisors, judges, and sub-governors. Before Ziyad came to Basra, the nights were dangerous because of the criminal element. But after he became governor, it got dangerous because of a different reason. Ziyad would delay the night prayer, that is, Salat al-Isha, until very, very late, and then he would order the imam to recite the longest chapters from the Quran. When the prayer was finished, the Shurta, that is his police force, would go throughout the city looking to see anyone who was not at the masjid. Any man they caught who wasn't at the masjid was killed on the spot. There's a reason for this. It wasn't because he wanted to enforce people to pray in congregation or anything like that. The reason is because the Khawarij used to plot their rebellions at night while everyone else was praying at the masjid. Ziyad wanted to prevent that from happening on his watch, and so any man not at the masjid was assumed to be a Khawarij and executed immediately. Now, there's a story that one night the Shurta came across a Bedouin who wasn't from the area who happened to be traveling through Basra at this time. And he was brought before Ziyad and questioned as to why he wasn't at the prayer. And this is the Bedouin's response. Remember, he isn't from this area. He isn't from Basra. He doesn't know the rules. I arrived at night with my camel but had no place to secure her. I was waiting for the morning to come when the police arrested me. To that, Ziyad replied, By Allah, I believe you're telling the truth, but your death will set a good example for everyone else. And with that, the poor Bedouin was beheaded. Not surprisingly, Ziyad was especially harsh on the Khawarij. Just before he became the governor, 2 men from Basra became a rebellion proclaiming, Let the Quran decide. If this sounds familiar to you, this was the original slogan of the Khawarij during the time of Ali ibn Abi Talib. These Khawarij in Basra, they based their rebellion in Ahwaz, which was about 75 miles northeast of Basra. But after hearing of Ziyad's policies, they thought it was best to abandon their plans. Kind of makes sense. Well, one of the rebels returned to the city and he hid, but it wasn't long before Ziyad's Shurta, before his police flushed him out. Well, the police caught him, executed him immediately, and nailed his body to his house door. Ziyad was a little bit more merciful to the second rebel. This man was allowed to return to Basra, but he was warned that he could never leave the city. But one night, Ziyad was informed that the second former rebel did not spend the night in his house. Don't know where he spent, doesn't mean that he necessarily left the city, but the next morning, that second rebel was arrested and executed. Later on, Ziyad ibn Abihi ordered the people of Basra to assist him in hunting down whatever remaining Khawarij there were in Basra. And he warned them that if they did not help, no one would receive their government stipends for an entire year. Well, this kicked off a mass persecution of anyone even suspected of being a Khawarij. The Khawarij and the Khawarij sympathizers were hunted down and killed by the hundreds. There was one instance when the people of Basra actually did stand up to Ziyad. He had once given the order to execute all of the Zoroastrian priests living in Basra and destroy their temples. But surprisingly, his shurta, his policemen, were blocked by the Muslim citizens, demanding that he respect their tradition of tolerance, of religious tolerance. Well, as controversial as they were, Ziyad's brutal methods actually began to bear some fruit. People began leaving their doors unlocked. If something was dropped in the street, no one would dare touch it. The people stopped being afraid of crime, and instead they became afraid of the government. With stability came prosperity. Basra's tax revenue increased, its trade improved, and rebellion all but disappeared. Muawiyyah was so pleased and so satisfied with Ziyad's performance that he added Oman and Bahrain to his territory. So when Basra had finally been stabilized, Ziyad began expanding his territory by launching invasions into Central Asia. In 47 AH, 3 years after becoming governor, Ziyad sent armies east into Ghor and Kabul in modern-day Afghanistan, and then he also sent armies into Bukhara and Samarkand in what is now modern-day Uzbekistan. Unrest in Kufa. Things were very different in Kufa, where Muawiyyah ibn Shu'bah was the governor. Even though he was strict and swift with justice, Muawiyyah's administration just wasn't as brutal as Ziyad's in Basra. According to Tariq al-Tabari, Muawiyyah ibn Shu'bah ended each sermon by praising Uthman radiallahu anhu and cursing his killers, according to Tariq al-Tabari. And this would often lead to condemnations of Ali ibn Abi Talib as well, which didn't sit well with everyone in Ali's former capital. A man named Hujr ibn Adi had been a commander in Ali's army, and he was totally devoted to Ali. He believed the caliphate should have stayed with Ali's family. If this sounds familiar to you, this is because it marks the early stages of the Sharia belief that the caliphate was hereditary and it should stay with Ahlul Bayt, or the people of the house. Ahlul Bayt means basically the Prophet's family. However, it should be understood that Hujr ibn Adi wasn't a Shiite like we know them today. He was a Sahaba, at least there are some reports that he was a Sahaba, but he simply felt that Ali was the true Caliph and he had the right to be the Caliph. And if not Ali, then it should have gone to one of his sons. When Ali's son Hassan abdicated the Khilafat, Hujr ibn Adi gave the bay'ah to Muawiyyah just like everybody else did. And even though he preferred that the caliphate remain within Ahlul Bayt, Hujr ibn Adi had tolerated Muawiyyah and he obeyed the leadership. But Hujr ibn Adi wasn't going to tolerate anyone cursing Ali. It was one thing to accept defeat. Muawiyyah won, okay, that's it. But it was something very much different to curse the Prophet's cousin and his son-in-law. So when Muawiyyah ibn Shu'bah, Muawiyyah's governor of Kufa, began condemning Ali, Hujr began shouting at him from the audience. Remember, they're in the masjid after Salat. Here's one thing that he said. "Old man, fix our rations and stipends. That is your job as governor. We are not here to listen to you curse Ali and praise the criminals." When Hujr ibn Adi said this, other people joined in, and before long, Muawiyyah was standing up and shouting and back and forth with the audience, just complete chaos. Eventually, Muawiyyah ibn Shu'bah stormed out of the masjid and returned to his home, and some of his advisors came to him and said that he should have taken a firmer stance against Hujr ibn Adi. But Muawiyyah wasn't worried about it. He responded with this statement. This is coming from Tariq al-Tabari. "I have already killed him. Another governor will take over after me, and Hujr will treat that man like he treated me, and he will be punished in the worst way. My time draws near, and I do not want to end it by killing the noble people of this city." Based upon that, it seems like Muawiyyah could sense the end of his life coming soon. Well, later that year, a plague swept through Kufa, killing hundreds of people. And as the epidemic intensified, Muawiyyah ibn Shu'bah and many others fled the city. After the disease had died down and run its course, he returned back home to Kufa, hoping that the worst of it had passed. Unfortunately, Mughira ibn Shu'bah still contracted the sickness and he died in Sha'ban 50 AH, roughly corresponding to September 670 CE. After Mughira's death, Muawiyyah now needed a governor of Kufa. So he wrote a letter to Ziyad ibn Abihi ordering him to take over Kufa as well. He was going to have Basra and Kufa, basically all of Iraq. This unprecedented move made Ziyad ibn Abihi the second most powerful man in the empire in the Caliphate after Muawiyyah ibn Abi Sufyan. The territory that this now put under Ziyad's authority was equal to almost half of the Muslim empire. This was an area covering about 7 modern nations. Ziyad, he brought that same brutal efficiency they had in Basra, he brought it over to Kufa as well. In his first public address in Kufa, he ascended the pulpit and began praising the people of the city. Here's an excerpt from his speech, translated into English, of course. When I was ordered to come to Kufa, I was thinking about bringing 2,000 soldiers with me. Then I remembered that you are people of truth who reject falsehood. Thus, I only came with my family. But then somebody stood up and threw a handful of pebbles at him. And then others stood up and started doing the same. And soon the entire audience was standing up and throwing pebbles and dirt at Ziyad ibn Abihi. This might have been anger at him for betraying Ali, or maybe they had heard of his brutality in Basra. They're trying to say, we ain't going to bring that here, buddy. I don't know, but we have a whole audience, a whole masjid basically throwing pebbles and dirt at Ziyad ibn Abihi. Well, Ziyad, he just quietly sat down and let the pebbles fly around him. And when they finally died down, he ordered his guards to go and lock the doors to the masjid. Then he stood up, placed a chair by the door, sat down on the chair. Then he began calling the people in the audience up in groups of 4. He ordered them to come forward and swear to Allah in front of him that none of them had thrown pebbles at him. Those that swore, they were allowed to leave. Those that did not were told to sit back down. By the time everyone in the masjid had been questioned, there were about 80 men left in the mosque. Ziyad ordered his guards to chop off their hands. Well, according to Tariq al-Tabari, just like Mughira ibn Shu'bah before him, Ziyad ibn Abihi would praise Uthman radiallahu anhu and curse Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu whenever he gave a speech. And just like with Mughira, Hujr ibn Adi, the guy that we mentioned earlier, and his supporters began shouting at him whenever that happened. And Ziyad's response was, once again, cool and eloquent. Here's what he said according to Tariq al-Tabari. Injustice and transgression have fatal consequences. These people have gathered for evil purposes. They feel safe with me, so they've taken liberties with me. By Allah, if you do not stop, I will cure you with your own medicine. Be careful, Hujr. You have invited a wolf for dinner. Well, Ziyad ibn Abihi was a man of his word. Like one report said of him, by Allah, we never accused him of lying. Whether he promised us good or evil, he always did it. In the next episode, inshallah, we'll discuss the story of Hujr ibn Adi. But until then, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. You've been listening to the Islamic History Podcast, and we hope you've enjoyed the show. You can support the Islamic History Podcast and get exclusive content by subscribing to our premium channel, Islamic History Exclusive. If you're listening on YouTube, just click the join button to become a member. If you're an Apple or Spotify user, open the app and search for Islamic History Exclusive. If you're listening on Podbean, become a patron in the app and you'll get access to our premium content. You can also join by visiting patreon.com/Islamic History. I'd also like to thank Brother Zulfikar Sarosh for his research and support of the show, and thanks to all of our premium subscribers. Be sure to join the Islamic History Podcast Telegram group where you can download a copy of today's transcript. And finally, subscribe to the Islamic History Podcast on YouTube for our video documentaries. Stay tuned for a short clip from our series on Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. And until next time, my name is Muttaqi Ismail for the Islamic History Podcast. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to Islamic History Exclusive. This is the podcast exclusively for Patreon subscribers of the Islamic History Podcast. And in this series, we are discussing the life of Saladin. In the Islamic world, in the Muslim world, he's known as Salahuddin ibn Yusuf al-Ayyubi. He is the Muslim hero who freed Jerusalem from the Crusaders and returned it to Islamic rule. In this part of the series, this is only episode 2, we are currently discussing the Crusades, the actual Crusades and the battles that led to the conquest of Jerusalem by the Crusaders. And these events happened roughly 40 years before Salahuddin was even born. And so a brief recap of the previous episode. In the first episode, we discussed the condition of the Muslim and Christian worlds at the time of the Crusades. We also looked at the events that led to the launch of the Crusades. We also discussed the early failures and victories of the Crusaders after entering Anatolia. Anatolia is the ancient name for what is now called modern Turkey. And we ended last episode with the siege and capture of Nicaea in northwestern Anatolia. And with that, we shall now continue on with the story. The Battle of Dorylaeum. The Seljuk prince Kilij Arslan did not take the loss of Nicaea lightly. He kept an eye on the Crusaders, hoping for a chance to strike. He got his opportunity 2 months later in July 1097. Kilij Arslan ambushed Bohemond's forces at Dorylaeum in modern-day western Turkey, about 60 miles south of Nicaea. The Turks were lightly armored but were fast and agile. Where the Europeans preferred mass charges with their lances held out before them, the Turks were expert horsemen who could unleash a volley of arrows while riding at top speed. This style of fighting was common among the Turks and was used to great effect. They sacrificed defense for speed and tactics. While the bow was their primary weapon, Turkish soldiers often carried a short sword for close combat. Their usual battle tactic was to encircle the enemy while riding fast and hitting them with volleys of arrows. Then they would break off in retreat, hoping the enemy would follow them into an ambush. While this tactic worked well in surprise attacks, the Muslim armies of Palestine and Syria were beginning to experiment with different types of warfare. Many Muslim armies of the region had begun wearing heavier armor and utilizing new tactics and stronger weapons. They even made use of siege weaponry and relied more on their lances than on the bow and arrow. Kilij Arslan, however, had not yet evolved. He preferred the traditional Turkish hit-and-run tactics. When he attacked Bohemond's forces at Dorylaeum, the Crusaders used their superior armor to hold their ground. They were able to withstand the Turkish arrows until the main body of Crusaders showed up. And with that, Kilij Arslan and his fighters had to retreat. The Battle of Antioch. As the Crusaders continued to make their way across Asia Minor, they were under constant threat of attack. The region was still under Muslim rule, but the Muslims were so disunited they could never mount a coordinated attack. As they got closer to Syria, the Crusaders forged alliances with the local Armenian Christian community. This gave them access to vital resources and intel as they continued their push south towards Syria. Some of the Crusaders had no desire to capture Antioch for the Byzantines. Baldwin of Bouillon broke off from the main party and began his own conquest of eastern Turkey. In time, he would conquer a large swath of territory reaching all the way to the Euphrates River. This area would become the first Crusader state in the region, known as the County of Edessa. The rest of the Crusaders continued their journey towards Antioch in the extreme southern region of modern Turkey. They finally arrived in October 1097. Antioch was an ancient city and strategically important at the time. The Muslims first captured the city under the great general Khalid ibn Walid during the Caliphate of Umar ibn Khattab.